The numbers scrolling across the bottom of every news broadcast are telling a story that is far gentler than the truth. Right now, a synchronized macroecological anomaly is unfolding across the northern hemisphere, shattering familiar calendar expectations and exposing the structural limits of human survival. In the final week of June, weeks before the traditional height of summer, a dual-continent heat event has pinned more than 100 million Europeans under temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, while simultaneously forcing roughly 170 million Americans into a meteorological furnace. This is not ordinary regional variation. It is a structural shift in the baseline itself. In France, the National Weather Service documented a mainland record of 44.3 degrees Celsius, an absolute ceiling in French record-keeping. In southern Spain, the Anduja station registered 45.1 degrees, while the United Kingdom shattered a June record that had stood since 1976 by reaching 38 degrees. Historical markers that stood for half a century are being erased in a single afternoon. The scale of this crisis is quantified not just by thermometers, but by systemic deficits in human biology and institutional capacity. The World Health Organization has declared a health emergency, backed by the metric that extreme heat has claimed roughly 200,000 lives across Europe over the past 4 years alone. This invisible killer operates through the strict architectural logic of loads and structural limits, quietly stopping hearts in darkened rooms and care homes. Yet, the public and regulatory intuition is systematically calibrated to the wrong measurement. The ambient air temperature reported by meteorologists is a deceptive index. The true threshold of human survivability is determined by an entirely different metric known as the wet bulb temperature, which integrates ambient heat with atmospheric humidity to measure the absolute cooling capacity of evaporation. For decades, standard theoretical models placed the absolute limit of human tolerance at a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, a point where the human body can no longer reject its internally generated metabolic heat, leading to systemic hyperthermia and organ failure within 6 hours. However, recent empirical testing has shattered this academic comfort zone. Controlled environmental chamber studies have revealed that the true critical environmental limit for a young, healthy adult sits closer to 30.5 degrees Celsius, while for the elderly and vulnerable, the lethal threshold drops deep into the 20s. The protective barrier we believed we possessed was an illusion. The dangerous conditions are not a projection for the mid-century. They are pressing directly on tens of millions of people today. This systemic fever is not a collection of isolated local coincidences. It is the output of a single, hemisphere-wide mechanical apparatus. Massive high-pressure domes have parked over both Western Europe and the central United States, compressing and superheating the air column. Yet, while the eastern half of the United States bakes under this historic dome, the high peaks of the northern Rockies are simultaneously experiencing unseasonable snow. This apparent geographic contradiction is actually the ultimate diagnostic signature of a deeper structural failure in the planetary circulation system. It points directly to a radical distortion in the great river of high-altitude air that regulates the northern hemisphere, which raises the fundamental, urgent question that geophysical scientists are now forcing us to confront. What physical mechanism has broken the river in the sky, and how much room is actually left before our primary defense systems fail entirely? The mechanical failure of the atmospheric circulation system manifests as a direct distortion of the jet stream. To understand the physical interconnections driving this dual-continent heat event, one must analyze the energy budget of the planetary machine. The jet stream operates as a high-altitude river of air, powered strictly by the thermal contrast between the freezing Arctic pole and the warm tropics. This temperature differential generates the pressure gradient necessary to maintain a fast, linear, west-to-east atmospheric current, acting as a structural barrier that keeps weather systems moving. However, the source data confirms that this engine is undergoing a profound thermodynamic shift. Through the process of Arctic amplification, the polar region is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. As the cold boundary heats up, the temperature gradient between the pole and the equator narrows, causing the jet stream to lose its velocity and buckle. Instead of a stable, fast-flowing channel, the river in the sky degrades into highly exaggerated, slow-moving waves that bulge far to the north and plunge deep to the south. This structural buckling explains the apparent paradox of late June snow in the northern Rockies occurring simultaneously with triple-digit heat in Washington and New York. They are not opposing weather stories, but the synchronized spatial output of a single fractured atmospheric wave. Where the wave loops north, it drags tropical air upward, creating a high-pressure dome that traps, compresses, and continuously superheats the air mass below. Because the jet stream has lost its momentum, these loops become stationary, pinning extreme conditions over populated land masses for days or weeks at a time. This macrostructural stasis forces the crisis down to the next systemic level: the regional infrastructure and the urban landscape. When a heat dome stalls over a major metropolitan area, it interacts viciously with the built environment through the urban heat island effect. Concrete, brick, and asphalt act as giant thermal batteries, absorbing solar radiation throughout the day. In northern cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where historic record-keeping indicates that triple-digit June heat has not been witnessed in decades, the infrastructure is physically unprepared. Residential buildings engineered for heat retention rather than rejection turn into structural ovens. As ambient temperatures climb toward 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the system encounters a compounding environmental variable: humidity. In the American heartland, this atmospheric moisture is actively amplified by agriculture through corn sweat, a process where mature crops pump vast quantities of water vapor into the lower atmosphere. The combination of stagnant air, concrete thermal mass, and agricultural moisture spikes the heat index to between 105 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. This environmental load triggers an immediate crisis within the electrical grid as millions of cooling systems strain simultaneously. The structural risk is binary. If the grid suffers an overload failure, the artificial cooling that keeps millions of people below their critical biological limit instantly switches off, transforming an infrastructure failure into an immediate mass casualty event. This brings the analytical lens to the final, micro-component level of the system: the human body. The physical laws governing human survival dictate that internal core temperatures must remain locked near 37 degrees Celsius. To maintain this equilibrium against a hostile environment, the body relies on the thermodynamic principle of latent heat exchange through the evaporation of sweat. However, as the wet bulb temperature rises, the atmospheric saturation capacity drops to zero. When moisture levels hit the critical thresholds documented by researchers at Pennsylvania State University, the evaporation pathway is physically blocked. Sweat no longer removes heat. It merely runs off the skin, rendering hydration useless against hyperthermia. Concurrently, the cardiovascular system is forced into a state of extreme stress, pumping massive volumes of blood to the skin to reject heat, which causes the blood to thicken and the heart rate to accelerate. For the elderly, the chronically ill, and the isolated, this biological load rapidly exceeds structural capacity. The reason heat waves quietly fill morgues is that the fatal failure is often recorded under secondary diagnoses like cardiac arrest or respiratory failure, masking the true environmental cause. The disaster operates in absolute silence, leaving no debris field, but systematically extracting its toll from the most vulnerable components of the population. The lethal efficiency of this thermodynamic trap accelerates exponentially when the system transitions from the blazing peak of the afternoon into the darkness of the night. A fundamental myth embedded in public perception is the assumption that the threat clears when the sun goes down. That darkness brings automatic relief. Deconstructing this superficial interpretation requires looking at the daily cycle of human biology and the architectural storage of energy. The human organism is evolutionarily engineered around a daily pattern of thermal repair, relying explicitly on a cool overnight window to lower its core temperature, reduce cardiovascular strain, and reset its cooling mechanisms. When the atmospheric circulation system stalls, this window of biological recovery is completely closed. The overnight low temperature functions as the true statistical predictor of mortality in a heat wave, because while the daytime high inflicts acute suffering, the unrelenting overnight low is what physically breaks the organism. The source material documents this precise mechanism operating at a historic scale, with France recording its hottest night since 1947, and Portugal experiencing nationwide tropical nights where the temperature refused to drop below 20 degrees Celsius. In major American metropolitan areas, the forecast maps project overnight lows failing to drop below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. This lack of nighttime cooling subjects the human body to a continuous, unyielding thermal load. Without a recovery window, the organism enters each successive day with an elevated core temperature and an already exhausted cardiovascular system. The physical damage accumulates relentlessly over a span of consecutive days. This macro-environmental load interacts directly with the socio-economic geography of modern cities. In dense urban centers, the combination of the urban heat island effect and high overnight humidity keeps the indoor wet bulb temperature stubbornly high throughout the night. The historical baseline for this specific danger is the Chicago heat wave of 1995, where a 5-day stagnant system killed more than 700 people in a single city, filling refrigerated trucks used as makeshift morgues. The casualties were overwhelmingly elderly, impoverished, and isolated individuals trapped inside top-floor apartments without air conditioning, where structural heat retention transformed residential spaces into literal ovens. This pattern is repeating today across 2 continents, driven by the profound mismatch between the ambient temperature recorded on the news and the actual physical conditions inside uncooled living spaces. The new empirical data from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences underscores the precision of this danger, revealing that for older adults, the lethal wet bulb threshold can sit as low as the low 20s on the Celsius scale, a range that standard warning systems categorize as merely a warm summer day. Consequently, our regulatory alert thresholds are systematically calibrated to sound the alarm too late, leaving a massive, invisible population completely unprotected during the hours of darkness. The physical limits of survival are further compressed when a high-intensity heat wave collides with the social rituals of the summer calendar, such as the outdoor gatherings surrounding the 4th of July. Because the calendar dictates a time for celebration, healthy adults routinely engage in heavy physical exertion, pushing their internal metabolic heat generation past the body's capacity for environmental rejection. This explains the documented spike in acute heat illness among amateur athletes and outdoor laborers, who operate under the false assumption that youth and personal fitness serve as an absolute shield. The source text shatters this assumption by revealing that even the strongest, healthiest volunteers in laboratory chambers begin to suffer irreversible core temperature climbs once the wet bulb threshold moves into the low 30s. The margin of safety is structurally narrower than society assumes, and the systemic load is steadily outrunning our engineered defenses. As the atmospheric loops remain locked in place, the operational limits of both human biology and mechanical infrastructure are being tested simultaneously, forcing us to ask how much structural capacity is actually left before the system experiences a total, irreversible collapse. The ultimate systemic contradiction of this crisis lies in the concept of livability versus mere survivability. While public safety frameworks focus heavily on the survival line, the absolute margin before the human machine undergoes fatal hyperthermia. The source material shifts our focus to a lower, more insidious threshold. Livability is the operational limit past which a human being can no longer work, learn, or maintain the basic functions of organized society. Long before the ambient air reaches a point that kills a healthy individual outright, the slow shutting down of economic and civic infrastructure begins. In France, this operational failure manifested through the mandatory closure of hundreds of schools when educational buildings, lacking structural heat rejection capabilities, became physically unsafe for children. This is the structural reality of a climate outrunning its architecture. The infrastructure of the modern West was engineered against a historical baseline that no longer exists. Roads buckle, rail lines warp, and the power grid operates at the absolute edge of its thermal capacity. The system is experiencing a progressive erosion of the invisible scaffolding that sustains urban life. When the World Health Organization classifies this event as a health emergency, it is acknowledging that wealthy, developed, and air-conditioned continents are running out of defensive margins. The statistical reality of 200,000 European heat deaths over the past 4 years demonstrates that our engineered defenses are merely mitigating the disaster at the edges rather than solving it. A critical deconstruction of public behavior during this event reveals how deeply our societal habits are mismatched with the new physical reality. When ambient temperatures spiked across France, at least 40 individuals drowned in rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. This distinct surge in accidental drownings highlights a tragic behavioral feedback loop, the natural human instinct to seek immediate physical relief from a furnace-like atmosphere drives populations into unmonitored aquatic environments, turning the act of flight into a primary vector of mortality. Similarly, the documented deaths of 2 children left inside a closed vehicle underscore the extreme kinetic acceleration of heat within confined manufactured spaces. A stationary automobile acts as a highly efficient greenhouse, trapping solar radiation and forcing interior temperatures past the point of biological survival within minutes, long before the surrounding air reaches its afternoon peak. The geographic scale of the phenomenon reinforces its systemic nature. The fact that 49 of France's 96 mainland departments were placed under the highest tier of meteorological alert, while 16 major Italian urban centers, including Rome, Milan, Florence, Turin, and Verona, simultaneously flashed red on the emergency maps, proves that these are not isolated local anomalies. They are the concurrent symptoms of a hemisphere-wide fever. The entire northern hemisphere is operating as a single patient under profound circulatory duress. The baseline has shifted, moving the entire range of what is meteorologically possible upward beneath our feet. The cold mathematics of excess mortality will continue to calculate the grim surplus of this event for weeks after the high-pressure domes finally disperse, revealing a final tally that historical precedents suggest will far exceed initial field reports. The lesson embedded in the data is absolute. We are measuring a high-intensity geophysical crisis with an obsolete ruler, relying on superficial indices while the real danger creeps steadily closer to the core of our biological and civilizational systems. The true limit of human endurance is not a distant theoretical boundary for the next generation to solve. It is an immediate structural barrier that parts of this planet are actively pressing against today. The thermodynamic breakdown of the hemisphere-wide weather pattern reaches its logical conclusion at the absolute boundary of global climate stability. To trace the ultimate physical root cause of this dual-continent crisis, we must look back to the high-altitude engine of the planet, where the narrowing temperature gradient between the rapidly warming Arctic and the tropics has permanently altered the behavior of the jet stream. When the temperature contrast shrinks, the velocity of this high-altitude current drops, forcing the river of air to buckle into massive looping waves that stall over the surface of the Earth. The source material demonstrates that this mechanical stasis is what connects the severe heat domes over Western Europe and the United States into a single synchronized atmospheric apparatus. It is a closed loop of cause and effect, where the stagnation of the jet stream pins high-pressure columns over populated landmasses, trapping and compressing air to generate extreme temperatures weeks ahead of schedule. Deconstructing the superficial interpretation that these heat waves are merely temporary, isolated weather events reveals a far more dangerous reality. We are witnessing a permanent upward shift in the baseline of planetary tolerance. The structural limits of both modern civilizational infrastructure and human biology are being systematically overwhelmed by this new meteorological state. When an entire continent like Europe faces an estimated 200,000 heat-related deaths over a 4-year span, or when 170 million Americans are simultaneously subjected to extreme heat indices, the system is signaling that its built-in safety margins have been entirely depleted. The historical memory upon which society builds its warning systems, architectural designs, and behavioral habits has become an obsolete guide for survival. The textbook assumption that a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius represents the universal boundary of human tolerance has been empirically disproven by direct laboratory testing. The critical environmental limit for the strongest human components fails at 30.5 degrees, while the threshold for the massive, vulnerable population of the elderly and chronically ill drops deep into the low 20s. This means that lethal heat stress is no longer an exotic, distant threat confined to the absolute extremes of the planet. It is actively penetrating dense urban centers today, under conditions that public metrics misclassify as ordinary summer weather. The invisible massacre that unfolded during the historical benchmark of the 1995 Chicago heatwave and the devastating European toll of 200,000 deaths in the recent past serve as concrete warnings of what happens when a prolonged thermal siege strips away the body's primary mechanism of nighttime recovery. When the nights fail to cool below critical limits like 20 degrees Celsius or 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the biological workload remains constant, leading to a cascading failure of internal organs and the eventual structural collapse of the cardiovascular system. The final boundary under examination is not a theoretical threshold on a scientist's chalkboard, but a hard physical limit governed by the laws of thermodynamics and energy exchange. As the planet's underlying circulation remains stuck in this distorted state, the margin between everyday life and civilizational paralysis is shrinking by the hour. The sobering conclusion dictated by the data is that society is running out of time to adapt its infrastructure to a baseline that has already moved. The future of lethal environmental load has arrived early, outrunning our warnings, exposing the deception of the thermometer, and forcing millions of people across 2 continents to live under a